You know what drives me absolutely crazy? You spend a whole weekend building a nice panel, maybe a tabletop or a cabinet side, and 3 weeks later, it starts cupping on you. Or you glue up a perfectly tight joint, and by spring, it has cracked right along the seam. We have all been there. We blame the wood, we blame the glue, we blame the humidity. But here is what changed my thinking. A few years back, I got invited to watch a group of traditional boat builders constructing a Viking ship replica in Norway. Real Norse methods, real hand tools, real timber selection the way it was done over 1,000 years ago. And I stood there watching these guys work, and I realized something that honestly embarrassed me a little. Problems I have been fighting my entire woodworking life, warping, splitting, joints failing, water getting in where it should not, these Scandinavian shipwrights solved all of it centuries before any of us were born. Today, I'm going to walk you through 10 modern woodworking problems that Viking shipwrights already had figured out, and how their solutions still work better than most of what we do in a modern shop. Plus, stick around to the end, because I will show you a marking technique I picked up from a Norwegian timber framer that I have been using on every project since. Let me show you what I found. The Viking shipbuilding tradition is one of the most practical, problem-solving woodworking systems ever developed. These were not decorative craftsmen. They were building vessels that had to survive the open North Atlantic, and their methods had to work, or people died. What is remarkable is how many of their solutions translate directly to the problems we face in a home shop today. So let me start with who these people actually were and why their approach deserves your attention. When most people hear Viking shipwright, they picture some rough bearded guy hacking at logs with a battle axe. That could not be further from the truth. Norse shipbuilders were among the most skilled woodworkers in the ancient world, and their knowledge was passed down through generations as carefully as any guild tradition in Europe. The ships they built, like the Gokstad ship from around 870 AD, were engineering masterpieces. That vessel is over 76 feet long, built almost entirely from oak, and when archaeologists pulled it out of the ground after 1,000 years, the joinery was still tight. Think about that for a moment. 1,000 years in the dirt, and the joints held. Here is what made their approach different from ours at the most fundamental level. They did not fight the wood. Every decision they made, from how they selected a tree to how they split and shaped it, was based on understanding how wood behaves naturally, and then using that behavior to their advantage, instead of trying to overpower it with fasteners, adhesives, and machines. They worked almost exclusively with green wood. They split rather than sawed, and they designed joints and structures that expected movement instead of trying to prevent it. That philosophy is the thread that runs through everything I'm about to show you, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The first problem most of us deal with constantly is wood that warps and cups after we bring it home from the lumberyard, and the Viking solution starts before the first cut is even made. Instead of sawing planks from a log the way a modern sawmill does, Norse shipwrights cleaved their timber radially. They would take a straight-grained oak log, split it in half with wedges, then split each half again, and keep going until they had wedge-shaped sections radiating out from the center of the log, like slices of a pie. Then they would use a side axe and a draw knife to shape each section into a plank. Here is why this matters so much. When you cleave radially, every single plank has its grain running straight through from face to face. There is no cross grain, no flat sawn figure that wants to cup, no reaction wood pulling in weird directions. The grain is perfectly oriented to resist warping. I tried this with a white oak log about 18 inches in diameter, splitting it with a froe and wedges, and the planks I got were more stable than anything I have ever pulled off a stack at the lumberyard. It was not even close. The second thing I noticed watching these builders was how carefully they chose which piece of wood went where. This was not random. They would look at a cleaved plank, study the grain, check for any twist or runout, and then decide exactly where in the hull that plank belonged. Curved grain went where the hull curved. Straight grain went on the flatter sections. Denser wood went below the waterline where strength mattered most. For us in the shop, the lesson is simple but powerful. Before you glue up a panel, before you cut your joinery, take 5 minutes and really look at every board. Check the end grain orientation. Check for crown and bow. Think about which face goes up and which faces out. Match your grain to the job it needs to do. It sounds obvious, but I will be honest. I spent years just grabbing the next board off the pile without thinking about it. That one habit, reading the grain before committing to a cut, has saved me more headaches than any tool I own. The third method is the one that really blew me away, and it solves a problem every outdoor woodworker has fought with. How do you seal a joint against water without modern caulking, silicone, or epoxy? The Vikings used a technique called clinker construction. Instead of butting planks edge to edge, they overlapped each plank so that the lower edge of one sat on top of the upper edge of the one below it, like clapboard siding on a house. Each overlap was about 1¼ inches. They would rivet through both layers with iron nails and rove them over on the inside with a small washer. Then between the overlapping faces, they laid a thin cord of wool soaked in pine tar. When the wood swelled from moisture, the overlap compressed that tarred wool and created a seal that got tighter the wetter it got. No silicone, no caulk gun, no reapplication every season. I have since used this same overlapping principle on an outdoor storage chest, lapping the side panels instead of edge joining them, and 2 winters later, there is 0 water penetration. It is a brilliant solution, hiding in plain sight. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now, this fourth method is the one that completely changed how I think about structural joinery. We have all been taught that a strong joint is a rigid joint, tight tenons, plenty of glue, maybe a bolt or a screw for good measure. The Vikings took the exact opposite approach for their ship frames. Instead of iron nails or rigid fasteners to attach the hull planking to the internal ribs, they used flexible lashings made from spruce roots. They would harvest the long, thin roots of Norwegian spruce, soak them until they were pliable, and then lash the planking to the ribs by threading the roots through small holes drilled with a hand auger. These lashings allowed the hull to flex under wave action instead of fighting it. A rigid connection would have cracked and failed in heavy seas. The flexible lashing let the whole structure move as a unit, absorbing energy instead of breaking. For us, the takeaway is enormous. Not every joint needs to be locked down tight. If you are building something that will experience seasonal movement, like a long breadboard end on a tabletop or a frame around a wide panel, think about whether a little flexibility built into the connection might actually make it last longer than brute force rigidity. The fifth solution addresses something I struggled with for years, which is joints that loosen over time as wood dries and shrinks. Viking shipwrights used green wood joinery deliberately. They would shape a tenon from partially dried wood and fit it into a mortise cut in greener wood. As both pieces continued to dry, the mortise shrank around the tenon, creating what is essentially a shrink-fit connection that gets tighter with age. This is the same principle behind traditional timber framing with drawboard pegs. You can use this today. If you are working with air-dried stock, try boring your peg holes slightly offset, so the peg draws the joint tight as you drive it home. The joint will only get stronger as the wood reaches equilibrium. I have used this on workbench construction, and the joints are as solid today as the day I drove those pegs, maybe more so. The sixth method goes back to how the wood is processed in the first place. Norse shipwrights did almost all of their shaping with axes, a broad axe for flattening faces, a side axe for tapering planks, and a hand adze for hollowing and smoothing. Here is what surprised me about this. An axe severs wood fibers cleanly, leaving the cell walls intact. A saw tears through them and exposes open pores. The practical difference is that axe-finished surfaces absorb less water and resist rot significantly better than sawn surfaces. I tested this myself by leaving 2 pieces of white oak outdoors for a full year. One face was sawn on the table saw. The other was dressed with a hatchet. The axe-dressed face was noticeably harder and showed less weathering after 12 months. You do not need to build everything with an axe, but if you are making anything for outdoor use, consider dressing exposed surfaces with a sharp draw knife or even a hand plane to close up those fibers. The seventh technique solves the problem of bending wood into curves without a steam box. Viking builders would heat planks over an open fire pit, sometimes with wet moss or seaweed laid on top, to create steam right at the surface. They could bend green oak planks that were only about 1 inch thick into surprisingly tight curves for the bow and stern sections of a ship. The combination of green wood, radial grain, and localized heat made this possible without the elaborate steam chambers we think we need. I am not suggesting you light a bonfire in your shop, but understanding that green wood, with straight radial grain, bends dramatically easier than kiln-dried flat sawn stock can save you a lot of frustration on curved projects. Start with green stock when you can, and your steam box will work twice as well. The eighth method is about finishing and preservation. While we are reaching for polyurethane and spar varnish, Viking builders protected their ships with a mixture of pine tar and linseed oil. Pine tar, also called Stockholm tar, penetrates deep into the wood fibers and is naturally antifungal and water resistant. It does not form a film on the surface that can crack and peel. It soaks in and becomes part of the wood. A mixture of about 3 parts pine tar to 1 part boiled linseed oil, thinned with a little turpentine, makes one of the best outdoor wood finishes I have ever used. I have been using it on garden furniture and tool handles for about 4 years now. It is easy to reapply, it smells incredible, and it just keeps working. No sanding between coats, no peeling, no cracking. The ninth solution addresses a problem that has been around forever. What do you do when you need a board that is longer than any single piece of timber you have available? The Vikings used long, tapered scarf joints. They would cut matching angles on the ends of 2 planks, typically at a ratio of about 8:1, meaning the taper was 8 times as long as the plank was thick. For a 1-inch plank, that is an 8-inch long scarf. They fastened these with rivets and tarred wool between the faces. This joint is incredibly strong because the glue surface area is enormous compared to a simple butt joint, and the tapered shape means the joint flexes gradually instead of creating a stress point. I use scarf joints now for any long trim work or outdoor projects where I need to join boards end to end. With modern wood glue on that big tapered face, the joint is essentially invisible and stronger than the wood around it. The 10th method is one that took me a while to appreciate. Viking shipwrights did not work from measured plans the way we do. They used templates, story sticks, and their eye. A master builder would shape a reference frame or a template from a thin board, and every plank would be fitted to the actual shape of the hull as it was built, not to a number on a drawing. This is direct scribing and fitting, and it produces results that are far more accurate than trusting a tape measure on a complex curve. I have started using this approach whenever I am fitting trim to an uneven wall or scribing a countertop to an out-of-square corner. Instead of measuring the gap and transferring the number, I use a thin piece of scrap as a template, mark the exact profile, and transfer it directly. The fit is always better. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that these Norse traditions handle completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for the strongest possible fastener on every joint. We default to screws, bolts, and construction adhesive because we think strength means rigidity. But as those spruce root lashings prove, sometimes a connection that can flex will outlast one that is locked down tight. Rigidity creates stress points. Flexibility distributes load. The second pattern is trusting the lumberyard to give us stable wood. We buy kiln-dried boards and assume they are ready to go. But the Vikings knew that how wood is split from the log matters more than how it is dried. Radially cleaved stock is inherently more stable, and you can achieve something similar by paying close attention to the grain orientation of every board you buy. Look at the end grain. Choose quarter sawn or rift sawn stock when stability matters. The third pattern is relying on surface films for outdoor protection. We slap on a coat of poly or spar varnish and wonder why it peels in 2 years. Penetrating finishes like pine tar and oil work with the wood instead of trying to seal it under a plastic shell. The surface can breathe, the finish moves with the wood, and reapplication is simple. The fourth pattern is measuring everything and scribing nothing. We are so attached to our tape measures and combination squares that we forget the most accurate way to fit 2 pieces together is to hold one against the other and mark it directly. The Vikings built 70-foot ships this way. We can certainly fit a bookcase shelf this way. The good news is once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This one comes from a Norwegian timber framer I watched working on a restoration project, and I have never seen it in any American woodworking book. When he needed to mark a straight line down the length of a log for hewing, instead of using a chalk line the way we would, he used a charred stick. He would take a thin branch of birch, char the end in a fire until it was solid carbon, and then use it like a giant pencil against a straight edge. The line it left was razor thin, highly visible on both green and dry wood, and it did not smear or blow away in the wind like chalk. But here is the best part. When he was done shaping, any remaining charcoal marks had actually sealed the surface fibers they touched. The carbon acted as a mild preservative right along the layout line. I started keeping a few charred birch sticks in my shop for layout work on rough lumber and timber framing projects. They work beautifully on oak and ash. The line is easier to see than pencil on rough grain, and there is something deeply satisfying about using a marking tool that costs nothing and works better than what you can buy at the hardware store. Before you head out, I want to make sure you know about my book, Secrets of the Shipyard. It goes way deeper than any single video can, with 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, and 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. If you want to bring these old shipwright methods into your own shop, this is the guide to do it. Just scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description to get your copy. Thanks for spending time with me today, and if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one.